ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for coming tonight to the impact of healthcare law and ethics on the incarcerated individual, featuring Greg Dober. So I just have a couple quick things to go over. So I'm Sarah, I'm the Cure Project Coordinator here at Carlo, by the way. Hi to everyone who I don't know. Most of you should know me. So I just have a couple quick things, and then Dr. Stott's gonna come on up and introduce Greg for us. So first, this is just some disclosure of sponsor support, lots of money stuff, things like that. Tonight's event is co-sponsored, by the way. So it's the CURE program, the Kenneth D. Hines Endowment for Ethics in the Professions, and the Atkins Center for Ethics are all sponsoring this event. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and read off what's on this slide to make sure you guys have all the good information. So the CURE program is a grant-funded initiative supported by the Human Services and Resources Administration that seeks to provide PsyD and MSW students with hands-on interdisciplinary experience working with vulnerable populations in underserved areas. Is that better? Sorry about that. So the objective of the program is to create a mutually beneficial relationship with field and internship sites where students increase their knowledge and competencies in interdisciplinary settings while simultaneously meeting the needs of organizations, agencies, and underserved communities. The Atkins Center was founded in 2017 through a generous endowment by Michael and Dr. Pat Atkins. The Atkins Center is committed to bringing ethical reflection to bear on important social issues through teaching, community engagement, and scholarship. So the last thing from me, for anyone that wants CEs for tonight, you actually have to do two different things. It's a little bit different than it was last year. So make sure that you sign in. In the back on the table, we have some sheets with like QR codes on them. You can just scan that and sign in. Also, if you're a CURE student and you need to prove that you were here for some reason, unless you're using the sign-in sheet for Dr. Stott, you can also use that QR code to sign in. For anyone who's on virtually, there is a link already in the chat, and you can go ahead and use that. And then at the end, we're going to give you a post-presentation survey. You have to complete that, hit submit, and then send a screenshot of the thank you screen to socialwork@carlo.edu. I'll give you guys a reminder at the end. You'll be able to see exactly what that looks like. But for now, Dr. Stott, if you want to come on up and introduce Greg.
All right, for those of you who don't know, my name is Carrie Stott. I'm the program director of the MSW program and also a faculty member here at Carlo. And I'm really excited that Greg just agreed to talk to all of us tonight. Even beyond who's in this room, there's a lot of people virtually at home coming to listen. So in May, I contacted Greg because he and I are colleagues from the ethics world to ask him if he would be a guest speaker in one of the classes I taught. So shout out to my students that are here. Greg agreed to speak to the larger audience, so I appreciate Justin Pearl partnering with us and bringing the Ethics Center, the Atkins Center for Ethics on board too, to make Greg's presentation more widely available, because I think it's a really important topic that so many people want and should know more about. So it is my pleasure to introduce Gregory Dober. Greg has been an instructor in biomedical ethics at various universities and hospitals. His work in healthcare ethics in the incarcerated individual has been published and cited in such publications as the American Journal of Bioethics, Prison Legal News, and various law reviews and journals. He is recognized within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as an official visitor in the corrections area with the Pennsylvania Prison Society. He resolves and mitigates conflicts between inmates in state and local corrections departments, focusing on healthcare related and other issues. He has consulted for various academic and clinical facilities across the country on healthcare ethics issues and incarceration, as well as peer-reviewed for various journals on the subject. Greg received a Master's of Arts in Bioethics and Health Policy from Loyola University and a Master's of Arts in Healthcare Ethics from Duquesne University. So in addition, he is also a member of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities and American Academy for Advancement of Science. So I am pleased to turn it over to Greg Dober.
First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a video. And we're not going to talk about this video during my presentation. We're actually going to wait till the end.
Screams, pleas, and protests inside an emergency room. The cries of a nurse handcuffed, captured by hospital and police cameras.
then walk.
The video that may have been edited shows University of Utah hospital nurse Alex Wubbles being confronted by two Salt Lake City police officers in July.
My heart was pounding and I had red flags. My flags were already waving for minutes.
Wubbles says Detective Jeff Payne demanded a blood sample from a truck driver severely burned and unconscious after a fiery crash caused by another car fleeing police.
This was something that you guys agreed to with this hospital.
Wubbles objects, citing the hospital's policy that blood can't be taken without consent from the patient, a warrant, or a patient that is under arrest. That's when Detective Payne reacts.
We're done. No, we're done. You're under arrest. Hey, we're done. Sir, I had administrative. Hey, sir.
You're assaulting me. Stop! Stop! I've done nothing wrong!
Payne says she was interfering with the investigation and that his commanding officer told him to make an arrest. Today, the Salt Lake City police chief says he apologized to Wubbles and that Detective Payne has been placed on paid administrative leave.
I want to be very clear. We take this very seriously.
Wubbles was detained for about 20 minutes before being released.
They're officers of the peace, and this was by no means a peaceful process when it very much so could have been.
A shocking arrest sparking outrage that Nurse Wubbles hopes leads to a positive change in the ER. Steve Patterson, NBC News.
If you notice, that wasn't in a prison, that was in a hospital. And one of the things I want to get across before I go on is, I've given this course to emergency room physicians and clinicians, mental health, cancer, oncology, palliative groups. This wasn't made because people say, well, what do I care? I'm not going to be in prison, or I'm not going to work in prison, so what do I care? I actually find the biggest problems outside of the institution, of the prison, at the hospital level, because most people don't know what they don't know. And there's a lot of assumptions made by healthcare workers, including social workers and everybody, when it comes to patient care. So this really is geared for those people who are going to be outside of the prison and will be working with any patient that could be part of a vulnerable population, such as those in the incarceration. One of the things I like to do is let people know there are some terms, and there's a difference between jails and prison. A lot of people, they use them interchange. Oh, he's going to jail, he's going to prison. Actually, jails are usually at the county or local level. So in Pennsylvania, we have systems, Allegheny County, Beaver County, Butler County, whatever county you're from, they have a jail. Then we have prisons. In the state, we have, I'm going to say 13 state correctional facilities. There is one at Muncie, PA for women, but those are prisons, state prisons. The nearest ones around here that I usually go to are Fayette, Somerset, Mercy, SCI, Greene, in Greene County. Some have a little bit more freedom, and when I say that, they maybe take the violent prisoners or the people who, they're more maximum security prisons maybe than a medium security. So they actually do that as well. And the reason I let people know is in jail, that's usually a pretrial detainee. That's somebody who hasn't usually met bail, which basically means that if you go to like Allegheny County Jail or any jail, probably 65% of those people are still considered innocent. The difference is they either got no bail, they haven't received bail, or they can't afford bail. So you're looking at 65% of the people in a jail that have never been to trial. So basically, the only difference between them and somebody else is somebody else can afford to take their relative home. These people can't. Or the bill is so high, it's just impossible. The other 35% may have already been sentenced as guilty. Now, if they get less than 2 years, they'll probably serve their time at the jail. If it goes above 2 years, usually they're transferred to one of the state prisons. So at that point, the state prisons usually are for the longer term, 2 years and plus. Jails are for those who are pretrial detainees and for those who are basically doing less than 2 years. A detainee is somebody who's literally been arrested and they've not been convicted. So when I say detainees, that's usually what the jails have, detainees. They've been arrested by our judicial system. The judicial system says they have the right to bail. The judge has the right to set that bail. That's going to be another conversation for another day with another person about our bail system in this country. But at that point, if they can't make it, they're in Allegheny County Jail. If they serve 6 months there and the judge says, oh, you're found guilty and you need to serve 6 months, they give them what they call time served. If they were sentenced to 6 months and they served 7, too bad. They lost a month of their life. So we actually take people's liberty away by making them a detainee. But what I'm getting at here is they still have rights when it comes to health care and treatments. An arrestee was detainee. A prisoner, it's usually somebody convicted and protected under the 8th Amendment. And I know everybody skipped that class in high school. It was like, why the hell am I going to learn all these amendments, all this constitutional stuff? Tonight here will be somewhat important, but it'll give you an idea of why the care has to be done for this population. An inmate, jail, prison, pretrial detainee, or convicted. There's a debate going on now, primarily in the academic world, no problem with academics, but they're saying we shouldn't be calling them inmates, prisons, and we should call them this and that. Here's the problem I have with it, and it's going to sound mean. If we spent more time on advocating for the rights of inmates rather than advocating on what we're supposed to call them, I think I would probably spend more time at home with my wife. So that's just me. If you want to call them an incarcerated individual, or you don't feel good calling them a prisoner or inmate, that's fine. One of the things I like to do is let everybody know what's in the system. Because again, this is the thing, a lot of times we get our information from TV. You go to some of these reality shows, and there's that one now, Locked, people go to jail and they're going to spend 60 days, and that's kind of how we get our reality anymore, is we watch these reality TV shows. But one of the things that I just want to let you know here, when you look at the statistics, the United States is the largest carceral country. I never say in the world, and I'll tell you why. We do beat China and Russia. I just don't trust their statistics, But we are the largest carceral country as far as inmates than any Western democracy. And what's funny is our crime rate is higher than most Western democracies. So that's the argument about is incarceration, and crime working. Again, that's another subject. But right now you have 5.5 million people in a system that either can deny them some liberties while they're on parole, probation, or while they're incarcerated. And people, in 2020, 1 in every 47 adults in the United States was on probation or parole or in jail. I would make the jokes when I go to a wedding to my wife. If there were 100 people there, I'd look around and I'd go, wonder which 2. And she kind of laughed because my whole point is 2 of these people here are in the system when you look at the statistics. No matter how good the family is, you want to say 2 of these people here were either served time or they're in the system somewhere. In 2020, an estimated 1 in every 100 adults were actually incarcerated in this country. And that came down, actually. From 2016, it was about 116. In 2022, it might have bounced a little bit below because of COVID, but it's gone back up. The system forgot about COVID, and the jails are filling up again. I always like to say, when you throw out a statistic, you can make whatever you want it to sound like unless you have a comparison. One of the things I always found interesting is that I now know why Putin is going to the prisons in Russia to recruit. If you look here, our correctional population in this country is higher than our armed forces. And that just goes to show you, you're more likely to run into somebody in our carceral system than somebody who's actually in our military. So especially, social workers, psychologists, you're likely to run into somebody who is either serving time or has served time or faster than you'll run into a veteran. And so I kind of like to give that statistic. Mental health and incarceration. Again, this would be a whole topic, but this is based on a score that is for the prevalence of serious psychological distress, and if they already had an indication that they had a mental disorder or a mental health disorder. In local jails, and I've seen this myself when I go to the local jails, about 65% of inmates have some type of mental illness. I'm not going to worry about the federal right now. In state prisons, it's about 50%. And if you said to me, is it serious? I would say yes. And I'm just going to throw out a few examples. I know we have time. Give you, for instance, I got a call one time from the state prison in Pittsburgh, an inmate wanted to talk to me. Now, he's serving 15 years for a crime. He obviously was sane when they convicted him. And I use that term loosely because the judicial system, all you have to do is present sin, that you're sane at the time of your hearing, and that's basically it. But he called me down because he wanted me to have the Department of Corrections of Pennsylvania pay for the operation to get the microchip out of his throat that they inserted via the meatloaf they gave him. So he was so convinced that the Department of Corrections just did this to mind control and track him. And of course, this thing, I'm sitting there going, he's in prison, he's in prison. That's because we shut down a lot of our hospitals for the criminally insane. If you go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, our new mental health facilities is the state and the local jails. And there are times when people say, well, how do you advocate for prisoners? I actually advocate in this case for corrections officials because they are not trained. They don't have the resources to deal with severely ill people of this magnitude. But yet the system keeps finding a way to put them there. I have another gentleman, he's 83 years old. I was called in by one of the county health welfare agencies to check on him. He went to prison about 3 years ago at the age of 80. I'm like, okay, he's not a lifer, he's in a local jail. They can't get him a hearing yet because he's so incompetent, because he had fired a gun at young neighbors who he believed were using mind control. And he even had his house tinfoiled inside. But yet he's sitting right now in a local jail today yet because they cannot determine if he's competent or incompetent to stand trial. So he's been in like 2.5 years. And I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but anybody that has tinfoil and has those problems, I'm not quite sure. I would try to figure out how to get them to have a trial for incompetency. The other problem is the jail's even more than willing to go to bat for him to say he's not competent. They can't find a nursing home that will take him because of his violent history. So this guy's nursing home right now is in a cell at one of the local county jails until the system figures out what to do with him. So that's where, the mental health and incarceration has become a problem. We can't treat them. We don't have the resources. In Pennsylvania, I'd like to give this as a profile because a lot of people often say, well, who's in jail? I've sat down with hundreds of inmates over my life. Some are double murders, some are rapists, some are drug addicts, drug possession, many of them. But people always, again, you watch TV, you say, oh, look, everybody's there is a murderer, there's a rapist. I'm not saying there's not bad people in prison. There's a lot of bad people in prison. But when you look at the FBI category, what they call the Uniform, I believe it's called Crime Registry, UCR, they classify offenses as part 1 meaning highly violent, or part 2 as being less than violent and less harm to society, even though are harm. If you look at part 1 offenses here, murder is only 4%. And I know that's all I say only, but murder is 4% of everybody in the state correctional institution. So, that's would be lower than most people they would believe the number. If you look again at even the most violent offenses here, that doesn't even come up to 50%. It's no surprise that our war on drugs is filling, because 21% of the people in the State Corrections Institute were drug addicts, more than likely, and ended up with possession charges. And again, I'm not talking about the drug kingpins here. They're usually in federal prison, because of the time they carry that much, it's usually a federal crime. I'm talking a lot of guys who were just busted for possessions, and maybe enough that they bought for them and their buddies, are driving home, and guess what? They have too much, they have enough that they would be considered a trafficker. So if you even look at the part 2 offenses, 21% of all people in Pennsylvania DOC are in for drug possession. So again, this is a population that's there that's, really isn't prevalent of violence. So, I know there's a big debate in our elections on this issue, but again, we're not talking everybody there is going to get some type of health care or right to health care, and they're violent. We got a lot of people who are brothers, our fathers, our sisters, our mothers, who are in prison. And, you know, they're not the people that we might watch on TV as the most violent. You know, is there a precedent for us to even care? I mean, you know, a lot of times you sit there and you say, is there really precedent? We got bigger problems in this country. There is precedent. Philosophically, we have a thing about virtual. You know, we have ethics, we have virtue, we have things we should do as people, philosophically, to help other people. Theologically, I mean, most monotheist religions have some type of golden rule, you know. Political science, this has been a debate back when, you know, the first penitentiary, little statistic because it's ever on Jeopardy, first penitentiary in the United States was in Philadelphia, and it was put together by the Quakers. And the Quakers actually put it together because they wanted to rehab people. And the day consisted of work and reading the Bible. And so back then, they were even like, prison should be rehabilitative rather than just a dark punishment. And then legal. We do have legal precedent. And I'm going to show some of those legal cases to start this off about why this population can't be forgotten in healthcare. It is actually part of the Constitution. And I'm going to get to that when I get to the legal, but we have so many precedents that say why this population is not to be forgotten when it comes to healthcare and healthcare ethics and healthcare decision-making rights. You know, what makes this population unique to treat? Adequate healthcare, and I'm going to throw this out, we'll get it a little later. This is the only population in the United States that adequate, I'm going to use the word adequate health care is required by the Constitution of the United States. And I know a lot of people want to argue constitutional, especially the last 4 years, but this has been backed up by the Supreme Court. They are the only population that we as a society have to give adequate health care. One that makes this is it's difficult to treat them because of obtaining informed consent. And really that comes into a few of the other things. Sometimes they're undereducated or uneducated. So if you're treating them medically, your job of informed consent, and I know Dr. Stott's going to be doing, I believe, a bioethics 101, so I won't steal her thunder. But when you're treating somebody, you have to give them informed consent. That informed consent means they have to understand what they're consenting to. Coercion, there's a lot of coercion at both levels. Inmates, and COs, you know, there's certain, you know, prisons, they don't want to take the guy to medical. Right now in Allegheny County, you're seeing a lot about something like we've had 17 deaths in Allegheny County jail over 2 years. And a lot of those issues were, why were they being held up? Why were we waiting till those inmates were ready to die before we took them? Because taking somebody to a hospital is an expense. And I'm not going to say that prisons do not look at the expense of sending an inmate to the hospital. You know, they hope to hell they do get better before they have to go that route. And sometimes they're wrong. So they could say, no, you're not sick enough, or no, you know, there's a lot of coercion, you know, peer pressure. Large number of mental health issues. Again, you're trying to get decisions and things out of this population that, again, it goes to informed consent. Can you really get it out of them? I'm going to talk different value set in a second. I'll go to that last. Lack of privacy and confidentiality. I can tell you this, everybody in prison knows what you're doing. I mean, trust me, when I even show up in a prison, there are people that, I swear to God, they're in a physical plant 3 miles from the place and they know I'm there looking at an inmate. I just don't get it. But inmates know what everybody's doing. They know what other inmates are doing. There's a lack of privacy. You stand in a line. If you get pills for hepatitis C, you all stand in a line together. And so everybody knows that, oh, Joe has hepatitis C too. So, I mean, there's no privacy. Guards, they see inmates going down to the hepatitis C line. They'll tell other inmates, you know, Joe has hepatitis C. It is unbelievable. I mean, it is like the gossip factory. It's unbelievable when you go into a prison, what they know. There's a lack of general resources, and most of that right now is not money, it's manpower and political will. Manpower, in fact, we do have a shortage right now in nursing, physicians, even in our own healthcare systems right now. But we also have a bigger nursing shortage and physician shortage in prisons. Differing value set. One of the things reason I want to talk about that is I would have never really thought of it until I did a visit one time. And when you do an ethics consult, one of the things you're always trying to find out is what a person's value is, because it can lead you to where their decision should be made. I got a call one time, probably about 6 years ago, from an older inmate that I had helped. And the older inmate was in his 50s, he had had a prior stroke. I mean, I helped him get some medical down here in Pittsburgh for his stroke, some rehab. About 3 months later, he sends me a letter, says, can you come up and talk to this one young 21-year-old male? He says, we play poker with him, and he's like all over the board. Like, there's something wrong with him, you know? And he says, and he almost has the same thought processes I had when I had my stroke. He says, so I asked him, he said, not I, but the inmate asked him, and he said, I found out when he was 18, he got arrested. He had severe sickle cell. He had a stroke when he was 19. They held off to trial. When he got better, he was in for drug possession, and he'll get out probably in about another 6 or 7 months. So he'd be like 22. So he's only serving like 2 years. So I told the inmate that referred me, I said, get permission for me, and I'll be glad to go up and talk to him if he agrees to talk to me. So I went up and I talked with him, and he looked at me and he says, you know, Mr. Dober, I really appreciate the help you want to get me, but I just have to tell you, I don't want it. I'll be honest with you, if you do an ethics consult and two families are trying to figure out should they pull end of life in that, there's some deliberation, there's some logic. And I'm like, okay, you want to tell me why? And he said, look, he said, here's the issue. He says, right now, people just think I'm stupid. But they know I'm street smart. If they know I am ill or vulnerable because of this stroke, it really sets me up on a security risk, either with the inmates and the other guards. Basically, he still wants to portray being a badass. And I'm not saying that in mockery. That is his value. His security is his value. And I looked at him, and I never thought I'd get an answer like that. And he said, look, he said, I get my GED, they're working. He goes, I have some problems, but they're taking some extra time tutoring me. I get out, I go home to Erie, Pennsylvania. In 6 months, I get to see my child, and I just went out here. And so what I did is I got him resources when he got back to Erie to go and maybe have some therapy. But that was the first time I ever encountered somebody saying to me, no, this is my value. And it's funny, I just told this story to somebody who's in physical therapy, and they told me this story Thursday. There was an inmate they had. He says, well, where can we get your hand back to? We look at the baseline and where it was. And he said, back to where I can punch somebody. And he gave the same story. He said, I'm not looking that you have trouble. He says, but if I get in trouble, I want to make sure my hand is still good enough that I can defend myself. And these are things, even as medical professionals, you have to say, this is ethical. I mean, it is what you have to do. We might want to talk them out of a million reasons, but this is their value. And it's not up to us to judge that value. So that's why I left the value for last there. We're going to go. One of the things we're going to do, and again, I don't want to steal the thunder of Bioethics 101. When we talk about the right for prisoners to make medical decisions out of the prison, in the hospital, in the doctor's office, anywhere they want to, there's some carceral cases we'll get into. But this right is given to them not by carceral cases, but by 2 bioethics cases that affects all of us, the guys behind bars. If it wasn't for these cases, let's put it this way, all I got to do, when I go to a doctor, if I get a call from a hospital, and they say, what should we do? Should we listen to this prisoner, do this? First thing I say is, go look up Quinlan and Cruzan. Most of them might be old enough where they already know what's in it. But this case does not waver just because somebody's behind bars. In the Quinlan case, it was a 1970 case where Karen Ann Quinlan had taken mixed drugs and alcohol. And she went into basically a persistent vegetative state. And since the audience is younger here, I'll give you a little bit of history back then. You just didn't easily have the autonomy of, we'll say, pulling the plug. Most of the states had laws that if you pulled the plug, you were going to jail for murder. So prior to 1976, this was a New Jersey case. The Quinlan family said, look, our daughter's in a persistent vegetative state. We would like to pull her off life support. The state of New Jersey said, if you pull her off life support, we are going to have you and the physicians arrested for murder. And this is the way it was prior to Quinlan. So this isn't like, oh, this was a unique case. This was actually the challenge to the period of years of this. So Quinlan then, they end up going through the courts. And the Supreme Court, this had to go to the Supreme Court because the courts would not rule. The New Jersey court, so it went to the federal court, it went to the federal court where they had to rule that basically they said that the only practical way to prevent destruction of rights is to permit the guardian of family to render their best judgment subject to the qualifications. So what the court ruled is you absolutely have the right as an individual to have your health care terminated if it comes to, you can have your withdrawal, have your health care withdrawn or withheld as a right to privacy. Before that, it was a criminal charge. So Quinlan set the stage basically for the right to die movement, and it also changed the way doctors did business now. Doctors and hospitals started ethics committees, and they started going into looking at these things and saying, we can't just charge everybody for murder. It's now on the books that it's their right. This here, the reason I use this, because this right extends to everybody in this room and everybody that's in 5.8 million people that are on the incarceration or parole listing. Cruzan, there was another case called Cruzan versus Director, Missouri Department of Health. Same thing, ironically, another young woman, only in her 20s, was in an auto accident. She ended up with, again, PVS. Now the difference was, even though the right to die was already established, the question was how much evidence does a state need for that right to die to be for the patient can have it done. And what Missouri contended was, look, we understand she has the right, you have the right to do that, but she left no advance directive, she left no living will, she left none of that. So we do not want to let society just decide among themselves. We think we're going to pull the care for her. We want the person to decide that. And that made sense because they're saying that the government has the right to ensure that people's, the right of life for a person, an adult person, isn't conflicted by somebody else. So in Cruzan, they end up going to court. Same thing happened. If you pull that, you're going to go to prison. They end up going to court, and the Cruzan decision basically said that if you have proof that somebody would not want to live in this state, this condition, then you can withhold or withdraw life support. And again, all they added was the fact that you need some type of proof. And this then became the advance directive era, where people start doing living wills and advance directives. So the reason I always give these two cases in a prison discussion, because these cases never went away. And when I find violations of decision-making against inmates, it's usually because it's just the basic decision-making rights and laws that either physicians think that there's some exception for when it's an inmate, or the jail feels that, oh, wait, we don't have to read that because that's out in that world and we can do what we want in this world. But these two cases set that precedent for us. Couple carceral legal cases. The first one I'm going to go to is Spicer v. Williamson. And this is an interesting case only because when somebody went to prison, basically it was up to the family to get them health care, to get them food a lot of times, whatever. In this case, Spicer's actually a surgeon. Williamson is actually a county commissioner. What happened was there was a robber, his name was Peter Gamble, and he was caught robbing. Sheriff went out and he shot the guy. It was a burglar. Well, usually they just took him to the local jail, and then the doctor came down, they paid him $3 or whatever, and he put him back in jail. Well, the doctor came down and said, I can't do anything with him. The wounds are so bad, he needs to go to a surgical hospital. And one of the things about then, if you go back and look at the history of medicine, a lot of surgical hospitals were private. Basically, it was a surgeon who started his own hospital. And that's kind of the way you treated people with surgery. So the sheriff then said, well, okay, so the sheriff then takes Peter Gamble to the surgical hospital. The surgeon saves his life. Surgeon sends him a bill. The sheriff says, I'm not paying it. He says, because I don't have the authority to pay it. He says, send it to the county. The county gets it. The county says, we ain't paying it because it's the warden's problem. We didn't give permission to send him for surgery. Well, what happened basically was the court ruled that Spicer, the surgeon, should have gotten paid. And this was really the first time on the books, even though it was a North Carolina court, that a judge actually basically came out and says, if you deprive a prisoner of their liberty and care, then we're responsible as a society to deal with it. So again, this I have one warden who always laughs, and he calls it, whenever he goes to his Jill board and they don't like what he says because it's too progressive, he calls it the hug a thug. This wasn't made by somebody who just decided, well, let's hug a thug today. This was decided, look, these people still have liberties, and if you look at Gamble, because he was a detainee, he was innocent anyway until when they arrested him. You know, they still had. Newman versus State of Alabama, this was the first time these really went to the Supreme Court of the United States, or the Federal Court of the United States. Newman, this was a class action suit that lasted about 7 years. And this basically was just Alabama inmates were so fed up. And a lot of you may not know this, you go look it up, but us old folks remember there was a governor down there named George Wallace. George Wallace was very racist, very right-wing, very conservative. And back then, conditions in Alabama, if you were black, was not a good place. So basically, the inmates, led by Newman, sued the state of Alabama, and they said the health care is just atrocious, and it was. And again, the court cited that it was the failure of Alabama to do this is a violation of the rights of prisoners guaranteed under the 8th and 14th Amendments of the United States. So that's where I said, as much as we want to get away from that political science and we learned in constitutional science, it comes back in this field because I'll tell you quickly what the 8th and 14th Amendments are. But this basically is the reason that inmates can get health care. Stell v. Gamble was the final case, and this set the bars, this set it in stone. This was a U.S. Supreme Court case. And again, this was the same thing. Estelle was actually warden, Gamble was actually inmate. And the reason this was in the Supreme Court, because Gamble had won at local courts. The state of Estelle and the state of Texas didn't like the verdict, so they took it to the Supreme Court. Now, this is sort of a victory for both of them, but Peter Gamble was on work detail, throwing bills of cotton around, and he ended up cracking a vertebrae. The warden and everybody said, you're a malingerer, so they threw him in solitary confinement. And every time he wouldn't go to work, they would throw him back in solitary confinement. They'd give him an aspirin here and there, and they'd say, you ready to go back to throwing bills around? They'd say, no, I can't get out of bed. They'd throw him in, they keep him in solitary confinement. So Estelle finally sued. And what the courts finally ruled, this was the first time that basically said that deliberate indifference to serious medical needs of prisoners constitute the unnecessary wanton infliction of pain. And then the court reasoned, since prisoners cannot care for themselves, the government has responsibility under the 8th Amendment to provide medical care. And for all those who don't remember what the 8th Amendment is, it's all right on the next slide. It is the simple one that basically says we are free from having to be tortured as part of our punishment. It's very simple. And that actually has a healthcare element to it here. 3 key terms, like it says, the 8th Amendment, deliberate indifference to serious needs. Very simple 8th Amendment. Excessive bail, we talk about bail, shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, or cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So the courts have ruled, if you have, I'm going to use the word inadequate health care, that it is cruel and unusual punishment. The 14th Amendment is really for the detainees, but either way, it goes and it says the same thing. It basically says that you can't deprive people without health care because that's not due process of law. If they're innocent, you can't just deprive them of it. They haven't been to court yet anyway. Here's the problem with we'll go back. The problem with the 8th Amendment claim is that in the Estelle case, one of the things they said was it has to be adequate health care. Here's the problem. No court since then has ever defined adequate health care. Even with Estelle, they basically said, malpractice care is okay. Maybe the warden wasn't being a jerk. Maybe they just suck at medicine. And the courts ruled that that's okay. You can suck at medicine and still be a good healthcare provider in jail because it does not rise to the level of a constitutional claim. And they basically told Estelle that, or Gamble that. They said, look, you don't have a claim here. We think you just had bad medicine. So if you want, you have the right to do a civil suit. Well, prisoners don't usually have lawyers hanging around. They can just do civil suits for malpractice. So basically, when I say it was won in part by both sides, the state of Texas got their way because the judge said, no, this isn't a constitutional issue because we believe it was malpractice. But on the other hand, the future was anytime you run into inadequate medical care, it will be a violation. So unfortunately, Estelle got nothing except malpractice care, but yet he set the world on fire for this with this case till today for healthcare. So the problem is the difference between adequate and malpractice care. And I kind of make the joke today that malpractice care is really what is practiced in a lot of jails. It's, again, malpractice care doesn't have a criminal liability. It has a civil liability. Inmates have the right to refuse care, same way we do. So again, an inmate can't be, and I'm finding this problematic in Allegheny County with some of our hospitals. I'm not going to go into the details, but I see a lot of the, a few of the hospitals, and I have the cases, I've looked at them, where they're letting the warden or the medical director at the Allegheny County Jail make medical decisions, either refusal or non-refusal, and they can't do that. An inmate has the right to refuse his own care. So if an inmate says, I don't want an x-ray, he don't get an x-ray. You can't, again, I showed you that, and I don't want to tip the hat, but we looked at that first video. First thing they said is, get him a blood draw. And just think of that video that, first of all, you can refuse a blood draw unless there's a subpoena. So again, inmates have the right to refuse care even in a hospital. There's precedent cases, and they also can refuse medical while they're in prison, mental health. Now, that's a very tough bar to set because one of the things the prison always argues is, in the jail, and it's usually rightfully, right, is we can give somebody, if we can force medicate them, if it's going to be for the better safety and security of the prison. And that's, I can't argue with that. That might be the best choice. But they do have precedent that they can refuse mental health drugs. But again, it's going to come down case by case and not carte blanche. Forced procedures. I actually get more phone calls on this than from hospitals throughout the country on anything else. And usually it's like, I have an inmate who's on a hunger strike. He's coming from the local jail. What should I do? And first thing I tell him is leave him alone. Don't touch him. Because here's the problem. Hunger strikes are legal. Judges tend to be liberal and always rule with the DOCs. But as long as the hunger strike isn't for trying to commit suicide, it is considered a First Amendment right to starve yourself for prison conditions or some type of prison change. The reason I tell doctors not to do it, or hospitals, is because you can have a battery claim against you. First of all, it's a medical procedure to force feed somebody. You have to use an NG tube, goes up their nose, down their throat, into their stomach. You can cause all kinds of problems. I mean, you get unlucky, you end up scratching the brain, you damage the lungs, you damage a lot of things. So first of all, you're doing a medical procedure. So it is a forced medical procedure to force feed somebody. The DOCs, their policies are, we give you 3 meals. If you refuse them, we don't give you any more, then we watch you, and they will force feed them. I mean, if they have to have guards hold the person down, they will force feed an inmate as long as it's in their facility. The reason I tell clinicians to never do it is exactly what I just said. If you go and look on feeding, the World Medical Association, of which the American Medical Association is a member of, actually has some declarations and guidelines on force feeding. And, you know, one of them is the WMA Declaration of Malta on hunger strikes. It blatantly just says, as a physician, you will not force feed a patient. Now, you could possibly force feed him if you believe he's committing suicide. But if I tell them you want a warrant. And so that's the first thing I tell the hospital lawyer. And for any hospital lawyers watching, I'm not ripping on you, but usually they're corporate guys. They don't get this. If they basically say, get us a warrant, and that warrant can be crap, and they will still honor it. Because most judges in this country they don't know the law when it comes to a lot of this stuff, and they do side with the DOC. And they will sign a warrant saying force feed them. I just did a talk at another hospital this week, and they were all kind of thinking about that, saying, you're right, we don't stick up enough for patients like this. We kind of just take that crappy warrant and do whatever the judge said. And I said, so even if the judge is wrong, you are implicit in his wrong decision. So one of the things I always say is, even if you get a warrant, subpoena, or a court order, don't consider it carte blanche. I mean, have somebody really read it. And I tell corporate attorneys that too, read the darn thing. Make sure that it is satisfying the doctors, because the doctors are the one that's going to pay a heavy price too if this goes to court. So I at least say, you know, don't take a blank warrant, or don't take a warrant that might not be satisfactory. Make them rewrite it. And the problem is, a lot of DOCs, a lot of corrections officers, and I hear this from nurses, doctors, clinicians, come in and say, my policy is, and most people see them as law enforcement. Just like the first sheriff we saw in that video, I am the law, you will do this. And a lot of clinicians tell me that is their fare. They don't know where the law enforcement takes over to the legality. Clinical applications, and again, we're going to deal with them as social workers, you're going to deal with them in a clinical setting. And a lot of times the clinical setting is you're going to get them into the hospital. A couple years ago, I was asked by one of the local hospitals to be a guardian for an inmate who had no family. He was in about 35 years. He was dying of COVID. He was on life support. Now, the reason they asked me to be a guardian is because they actually followed the law. And some hospitals in this area do, some don't. But again, Dr. Stott's going to teach you in detail this. But we have a decision-making process for patients in this country. And for us, the decision-making process basically says, if you have an advance directive, including do not resuscitate me, those are good. And even incarceration facilities ask inmates, do you want to do an advance directive or a DNR? I try to tell people, please do them, because you're making your own decision, because I've seen too many bad cases in the hospital where clinicians have made the wrong decisions. Medical decision-making, and this goes for all of us, should follow the same protocol for prisoners as non-prisoners. So there's no difference with me or with an inmate. How we go to a hospital, how we go to an emergency room, all the decision-making is the same. Prisons, guards, police officers are not medical decision-makers for an inmate. This one, if I could paste on many a head in a hospital, this would be the one. That, no, they don't make the medical decision because they said, my policy says, my policy says. Your policy does not usurp state and federal law. So this is one of my biggest problems with hospitals and clinicians. Many times they're either intimidated or they believe that it's law enforcement, so they must know the law. The prison medical officer must use the best interest model. Again, I know there's a prison, I know that one of the counties has a medical officer, you could just read the paper, you know which county, that kind of tries to make the decisions for the inmates themselves once they're shipped to UPMC facilities in Allegheny Healthcare. You can't do that. What you have to do is the best interest. That means once everybody else, you can't find anybody else to make a decision, your best interest, what you say is, what is in the patient's best interest? That's as far as I can go. And decision-making informed consent for an inmate detainee follows the same legal and ethical requirements as a non-inmate. And I'm going to tell you a story. And does anybody here know who Leon Ford is? Leon Ford is a big advocate here for the rights of people and the problems with policing we have. Leon, about 10 years ago, was shot. Leon was 19 years old, driving down the street in Pittsburgh. Might have ran a stop sign, but again, I'm just using that as that's what's in the police report. They thought Leon was some drug addict or drug dealer that they had a warrant out for, so they pulled him over. Leon lived at home, 19 years old. Before the night was over, Leon was shot in the back and paralyzed. Leon was taken to UPMC Presbyterian Hospital. Leon was unconscious, could not feel from the waist down, yet the police told them to shackle Leon to the bed. They shackled Leon to the bed because the police said so. He had a full-time guard inside his thing because we didn't want Leon to escape maybe when he wakes up, if he wakes up. So they had prison guards all over the place. But the real crime was this. Under Pennsylvania state law and in the decision-making process, he lived at home. His next of kin were his mom and dad. They had the right to make the medical decisions for him. But it took them 3 days to get into the hospital because they had to get a judge's order to approve it. Because the Bureau of Police had a little statement in their thing that we can deny anybody visiting a hospital as long as our zone commander wants to. I pointed out at that time, 10 years ago, because I was kind of pissed off, that is even illegal. You can't deny somebody's decision makers because you're the Bureau of Police. Now, it subsequently has been changed. But even the judge erred, and this is why I try to tell people that this is a very specific field. Judges don't always get it right. I have criminal lawyers that call me and say, now that my client's in jail and needs help, have medical care, what do I do? This is very specific. And what the judge should have done, he should have told the police, if you need a court order to keep Leon's parents out. But no, he went along with the whole charade because it was the city police in the city of Pittsburgh walking into his office and saying, we would like to keep them out, and the only way they're getting it is if you allow them. Should have been the opposite. And my whole point is this, as clinicians, that's why I said you have to challenge it somehow, because just because his family came in and visited 3 days later, my question was, who made the damn decisions for the last 72 hours? Was it the hospital? Was it the police sergeant? Who knows? So Leon has since had a civil case and everything else. I'm not going to go into that. But Leon it was a pretty bad thing as far as what happened to Leon and patients' rights at UPMC hospital with the city police. And that's why I tell people, you have to make yourself aware of these conditions. Don't always believe what you're hearing. And this is just, you don't have to go through this, but Pennsylvania, and one of the reasons, and this one I get a lot of use for in prisons. Pennsylvania actually has a law, it's called Act 169. And the law basically says, if you don't have an advance directive, if you don't have those other things, guess what? There's a lineage. So again, it's one of those things. So if we went with Leon, and at that time I argued with them, I even said, there's Act 169. The hospital threw their arms up and said, oh, we don't know, it's the police's problem. The police said, we don't give a shit about Act 169. When Act 169, I went to them and said, you guys are violating Act 169. If you go look at Leon, he wasn't married, so he had no spouse, he had no children. Hey, look, number 3, he has parents. But yet, they were allowing everybody in the city of Pittsburgh police force or wherever else make medical decisions for him. But boy, we forgot about his parents. And that is state law. So this is, again, when somebody says, oh, we make the decisions, the warden makes the decision. No, it does not. State law precludes them from making that decision. And I once told a Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reporter in an article, where do you see warden written in this list? I don't see it. So they're the last people that even should be considering making. Where do you see police officer in this list? They're the last one that should be telling somebody how to care for a detainee they bring in, or even a person they just arrested and injured. I'll go through there. Pennsylvania, one of the things that all that was is Pennsylvania does have a surrogacy. The Pennsylvania DOC does allow surrogacy, which basically means they will allow, if an inmate tells the jail, I want my wife to make decisions, they will allow that. Now, one of the things I tell inmates, I said, always be careful, and I tell everybody this, make sure your decision maker and the emergency person are either, think when you do it, because a lot of inmates will say, if I'm beaten, call my mother right away. Their mother's like 86 years old. Their mother couldn't make a decision in a heartbeat. I mean, if it was a major medical, and the mother wouldn't be objective. And I'm not saying that's bad, but they might even have some dementia problems. So usually I'll tell an inmate, make sure your emergency contact is capable of making the medical decisions. Because you can name, even in an advance directive, you could say, hey, my emergency contact is my mother, but she's a little bit out there, so the person I want making my medical decisions is my father. You can do that. There are two different roles. And I also tell inmates to understand that not necessarily your emergency contact may not be your person that's even allowed to make decisions. I mean, anybody can put in the jail, you know what, call Greg because my emergency contact. But I can't usurp their wife. I can't usurp their children under state law to make medical decisions. I'm only able to be notified and maybe call the wife and say, I got a call from the prison and there's a problem. So I always tell them, be very careful when you're making those two. They're two distinct things. When I do this, this is a decision-making model, and I say detainee, and please forgive my way I make things here. This really could be detainee, Dober, attendant, anybody. Here's how we do, I wonder if I should just wait for bioethics 101 here. But anyway, here's how this works. If we were pulled, and I'll give you this, me, I fall down right now. Nobody here really knows anything about me, so you take me to the ER. So I am at that point considered incapacitated. And say I fall down, but I'm still have capacity, but I start talking gibberish. Now I might have some competency problems there too. But if I have capacity and you take me to the ER, I break my arm and fall, I have to give informed consent for them to do the x-ray. Once we do the x-ray, if it's broke, we're going to cast you. Then they're giving me informed consent. And at that point, they're telling me, what do you want done? And I say, you know what? Cast it, fix it. Well, I do the same thing here. If you have capacity, a detainee is allowed to say, x-ray it and cast it. And they get treated like everybody else, and they either have to get released or admitted to the hospital. Very simple. I mean, there's no difference. If a person has no capacity, so I fall here right now, that's it, I'm out. You're all like, let's get him to the hospital. We have no idea if you have a heart attack or whatever. When they get me to the ER, they use what they call the best interest standard because they don't know what I want. So the first thing they do is they say, let's look at gray hair, probably has high cholesterol, probably smokes cigars, probably drinks bourbon, heart attack. So the first thing they do is they then rush me to get a heart catheterization. I didn't give them permission to do that, but they're allowed to do that because that's in my best interest. The ER is saying, look, we don't care if he has family, we don't care if he's homeless, we don't care if he's an inmate. This is what is in the best interest of this patient. So again, this would go with detainees. At that point, they might go through my wallet. They say, you know what, while he's there, let's go through his wallet, see if we find anybody. They might find an emergency number. So they might say, oh, here's his wife, or here's nothing's in there. So they'll try to determine my decision makers. At that point, if they call my wife, she now becomes my decision maker. If they don't find it, then if they find my wife, then they explain to her the informed consent process. And here's what I mean by that. I'm already in surgery, they open me up, and the first thing they say is, okay, we only started, but if he has a stroke during surgery, does he want do not resuscitate? Now they're going to explain, here's what we're going to do in the surgery. We're going to move his artery. So even though I'm laying there, when they call my wife, they have to go through the same process as if they were telling me, so that she can then make a true decision as a surrogate or substituted judgment. The reason I do this is basic model decision-making 101 for healthcare. It doesn't go, there's no difference between this one and if the person came out of a prison or out of a police car. That's kind of the same way. Security measures, this is one of the things I said, common sense should be necessary to determine 24-hour guard. Like I said, Leon had guards everywhere. Restraining devices are used for security and safety. They can be removed at the request of clinicians. And I had an interesting, I talked to a palliative group at one of the hospitals, and they had a good point with this. They said, you know, a lot of times we try to get guys and, you know, make sure that they can walk better and stuff like that, but the guards won't remove our shackles while they're in the hospital. So they're trying to teach physical therapy to somebody who still has the shackles on and they're trying to walk them. I said, you can tell them to remove it. They said, really? They said, our policy is we can't remove it. I said, their policy is their policy, but it doesn't usurp the fact that you have to give them medical care. Part of that medical care is you have to see where his baseline is. You have to see how he walks. I said, what you need to be recognized is that the guy does have a security issue. So, I mean, if you got Usain Bolt, the Jamaican runner, and he's the one you're taking shackles off, the guy, I just understand this guy's gonna run fast. He can run fast. I don't want to try to catch him. But if it's an 80-year-old guy and you're not taking shackles off to see him walk from a stroke, that's a whole different story. So I even tell the clinicians, there is some common sense in this. You know, I understand that. But it's not, again, carte blanche, because that's the way we do it. That's what they'll tell you. Individuals have the right to refuse medical care. You know, it was only up until 2 years ago, maybe 3, that pregnant women should not be in restraining devices. We had a big practice even here in Allegheny County up till 3 years ago that, wow, even while you were giving birth, we would possibly throw you on a gurney and restrain you and put restraining devices on. Now finally it's state law. All over the country, pregnant women are being strapped down on gurneys and giving birth. You know, what dignity, you know, because I don't know where they're going, you know. Palliative care. And unfortunately, you guys basically ask for the whole works. So usually you're going to get some of my little bit of things I gave to a trauma unit, to a palliative unit, so you're kind of getting it all there. There's a lot of barriers, and one of the things I get is, okay, what if they have cancer? Now I know a lot of patients, a lot of the jails and even the prisons do send patients to UPMC, to Allegheny Health System for oncology. So they do get a lot of issues as far as coming in, especially now we have the aging of our population of prisoners. You know, plus we have a lot of people who have either hepatitis C, HIV, and so eventually those things, if they're left untreated, you know, again, they get worse. But the barriers to palliative, and this is a tough one because a lot of them complain just about what I said about security. You know, the security and confidentiality and privacy usually goes in together, because if I want to tell a person something, security is usually there. And that's why I tell the doctors and tell them to leave. You know, tell them you can look out the window, I don't care. So there's a lot of barriers. In prison, forget it. If you go in and you're a doctor in prison, you're going to have very little confidentiality and privacy, because there will be a guard standing either at the cell or in the visiting area. Comfort and support is very difficult with this group because a lot of times they either have nobody. Right now, a lot of prisons still do not have personal visiting backup. A lot of the local jails found out that it was cheaper because of the lack of staffing they have in correctional offices just to do video visits. So there's a lot of jails in Western Pennsylvania that will not even allow visitors for inmates anymore. Pain management, you're restricted on what you can give a person in prison. Just about 10 years ago, I mean, there was a fight over Xanax, you know, that was considered hardcore, let alone considering giving them some type of opioid drug for severe pain. So pain management is very difficult with this population, because even if you're the oncologist and the palliative group out of the hospital, you might want to give them something for that pain, but they can't, that won't be allowed in the prison. Dietary, forget it. I mean, you know, you can have a good dietary for some of these patients while they're out, but basically when they go in, there's very, you know, dietary is limited. Can they make certain things salt-free and that? Yes, they can. But it still comes down to what's the flavor of the day. And most of the flavor of the day, I mean, I've had wardens tell me that most of the flavor of the day is nothing but fat comfort food, fatty comfort food at high calories. And so again, that's a problem. Compassionate release. I'm going to talk about compassionate release. If you ever want to do anything for this population, and you want to write your representative, this is the one thing you need to do. Compassionate release in Pennsylvania is probably number 50 out of 50 when it comes to being barbaric. The rule for compassionate release is this: you have to be terminally ill. Number 2, not ambulatory. Then number 3, expected to die in the near future. Number 4, to need a medical care that can be appropriately provided by a side. They all seem pretty simple. You say, wow, this just sounds like hospice care. I mean, how difficult is it to get a dying person in hospice? Well, let me just put it this way. I just visited an inmate at a state corrections facility who has stage 4 lung cancer. That was probably 2 weeks ago. I can tell you right now, he will die in prison. He probably only has about 4 or 5 months left. He wants to get out. The compassionate release process is abysmal. First of all, you have to file a petition. And it's not as simple as me and you filling it out. You have to have an attorney. Then the district attorney has to sign off on it. Then a judge, the judge who's sentenced may have to sign off. But here's the key: not ambulatory. That not ambulatory means if I can get up in the middle of the night and take a piss, I am ambulatory. So they literally mean you cannot get out of bed. Now, by the time if you ever dealt with people in this condition, sometimes they get out of bed up till 3 days before they pass when they go into the crisis of dying. I can tell you this: you're going to need 6 months, 4 months minimum, just to get the compassionate release in front of somebody who can sign it off. So when you see the person go down, they can walk, can't walk, that's 3 days. You don't even get it into the right hands by the time it gets through the system. So compassionate release in Pennsylvania is probably one of the most barbaric state legislative rules we have. It basically means that if you have a terminal illness in prison, you will die in prison. If you're 70 years old and you've been in for 50 years, and there's this theories about we age out of crime, whatever, it's almost impossible to get them out. They will die in prison. I've heard, a lot of times I'll try to find these stats. I've heard people tell me, like, we're talking handful of people get compassionate release. And it's so difficult. And again, number 2 is an issue. If you can walk, you can't get it. But they will say, come back when you can't walk, and we'll start the court proceedings. Great. He has 3 days, and court proceedings take 4 months. So it's the one thing in Pennsylvania that I wouldn't sound proud of in this state for criminal justice. Couple odds and ends. I always get this request because people talk about, what kind of therapy is for people who are on drug addicted when they go to jail or they're in prison. And actually there's 2 different types. When I say 2 different types, I'm going to say you got the local jails and the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. The local county jails, they provide some type of medically assisted therapy to incoming opioid addicted pregnant women. They can provide Vivitrol on release in some cases, and if you're not familiar with Vivitrol, it curbs the hunger for certain drugs. None or few in local county jails in this area, and even in Pennsylvania, have a continuing MAT program. So again, they'll throw people who have drug addictions in jails. And I'll be honest with you, all you're doing is basically letting them detox and hope they live through the detox. Because it's just what it is. They don't even have enough people in the jails that work there to handle it. Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, you get a little luckier, if you're not going to call it that. You can enter, if you're on MAT, so if you got a patient at the hospital, they're on some type of MAT and they're going to go to jail or they're going to go to prison, you can continue their MAT usually. So they can be released right from the hospital to prison and not miss medically assisted therapy. They use what they call the TC drug scale, TCU. It basically is a questionnaire of a drug appetite at Texas Christian University. It's online, you can look it up. Meds they can give it to PADOC, methadone, Vivitrol, Suboxone, Sublocade. Still difficult to get class 1 drugs for psych disorders or pain. Again, that's just one of those things that's very controlled. So it's hit and miss sometimes even at the PADOC how they treat drug addiction. But it's a lot better than the local counties. There are times when I'll meet inmates at the local county and I can't wait till they end up going to the prison because they are drug addict. I know they were convicted, and it's sort of like I want them to get to prison just so they can get better drug care. I mean, it's kind of sad that that's where it's at, but it's kind of what you have to look at. Public health issues, and this has been over the years. One of the improvements they actually made in public health is tobacco usage and STDs in prisons. Tobacco, if you have tobacco in prison now, you can end up spending time in solitary confinement. So they really went on a tobacco craze probably about in the 2000s. Now, again, you say, oh, that's really, here's the problem. A lot of this is, we'll call it dual-use technology. You know, the atom's okay as long as it's not the atom bomb. Tobacco usage, tobacco was used as a currency. So, I mean, even wardens didn't want it because people would get beat up over tobacco. You owe me 2 packs of cigarettes you lost in a poker game. So tobacco is actually a prison currency. So the wardens really weren't really as upset about, or weren't as thrilled about the public health initiative as much as they were the fact that tobacco will no longer be a currency. But they made great strides in that. Very difficult to find somebody with tobacco. STDs, they treat it pretty quickly now if you have STDs in prison. In treatment, improvement was still problematic. Treatments for HIV and HCV, very expensive. So, they have a criteria. If you go through our medical policy, when it comes to HCV, which is hepatitis C, they have a criteria that your blood tests have to be at certain levels. It has to be, you have to be really, really ready to lose your liver before you go with HCV, before you get the current treatments. But it's improvements because what they used to use was a drug called interferons, which only had like 60% efficacy. The new drugs have like a 93. These have very little side effects, and they take like 6 weeks. The interferons used to have major side effects and took like 24 weeks. Difference. The new direct-acting antivirus for hepatitis C is $60,000 a treatment. Interferons is probably $3,000 a treatment. But it has a very low efficacy rate. So that's why they said they triage liver disease now. Still problematic is infectious diseases such as flu and COVID-19. And let's face it, you're in an environment where people live together. A lot of times these places are not that well kept. Tuberculosis is another thing that's on the uprise here. Any institutional living like that, it's still problematic. In Texas, or one of the systems, they only had, this was back when there was swine flu killing people, they only had enough vaccines for 30% of the inmates. So it was like, well, the first 30% get it, because again, it's cost, but that would be great. The other 70% are just gonna have to chance it. So again, you had that. So, and the treatment for mental illnesses, I went over quite a few times, that's going to be a big problem. That problem's going to last for a long time until there's some political will to fix it in this country, out in the street and also in prison, and we just haven't had that yet. HIPAA, this is always an argument, and here's the problem with HIPAA. I tell people, say to me, what happens when the guard comes up and says, tell me what's going wrong with this guy? I says, you still have to listen to HIPAA, but, and I always got to do a but, the laws are slanted for the DOC, the Departments of Corrections in this country. I just want you to look at F. F really is the catch-all. And I mean, I give an example like this. If I have an inmate, he has COVID, he's at UPMC or Allegheny Health, Allegheny Hospital, and they want to take him back to the prison, and you've treated him, and he's still active with COVID. The transport officer, they'll put him in a van, does have the right to know that they're putting an infectious disease inmate in his van. Normally, you wouldn't think that, you really can't just run around and tell people, well, he has COVID, he has COVID. It would violate HIPAA. But in this case, the guard would have the right to know that this person has an infectious disease. Therefore, you would not even violate HIPAA if you were a physician. I says, but on the other hand, if they're just standing there and say, I don't know what's wrong with him, until he has a need to know, you don't have to tell them anything. But F always comes in later when you don't want it, the The person's already hospitalized. You don't think the warden really needs to know everything. The first thing they pulled is this, and this is always kind of a joke among people who deal with prisons. The administration and maintenance of safety, security, and good order of the Correctional Institute. Hell, they quote that for everything. They banned, one prison just banned books over 5 pounds. That was the reason they cited it. You can't have a book over 5 pounds because you could use it as a weapon. I had talked to a warden that won't give a lot of fruit on his plate, and this is a true story. He said because they will ferment the fruit, take it back to their cells and ferment it into alcohol. So he gives as little fruit as possible. And again, you want to take that to court, that's fine. And my whole point is this rule here that was there, they use that just about for every argument they can come up with. And they use it for HIPAA as well. So it's out there. So if you run into a case, you're really going to have just to be selective and specific. This is going to be Dr. Stott 101 also, Bioethics 101. The ethical principles in bioethics, autonomy, beneficence, which is, do good, non-maleficence is do no harm, and justice, they still apply to inmates. Distributive justice, really, in the inmates, but the problem comes in, there's a lot of difficulties. Cost containment. It's very difficult to give them the $60,000 HCV drug compared to maybe me going with insurance to the local hospital. You have a distributive justice issue there. Actionable steps, I always tell people, think like an ethics committee. An ethics committee is charged really with 3 things. Policy, so if you're a clinician, think of a policy you create. One of the hospitals has now created a forensic patients policy. Forensic patient meaning inmate, detainee. So they've now created one so that people can go to that computer and say, what do I do with this inmate if I have to make a decision? Education, make sure you educate people about what their rights are in this population. And consultation, get involved. Say, I know what, I'm not sure that's right. This has turned out kind of bad, but that's okay. What I usually do is I go through every year and I usually pick out what the biggest issues are. And this goes back 5 years. And this kind of goes to what I was just saying before. The biggest issue right now, and that'd be the post-pandemic mental illness due to social isolation. That right now probably took the treatment for COVID from last year. And that now made it probably the #1 problem that I'm seeing in jail. Just a lot of mental health issues, a lot more calls we're getting about people's mental health because it's just been so tough of a year. Treatment for infectious diseases is still going to be a problem because of the variants. Segregation and isolation, especially punitive, is still a problem. Inadequate mat treatment. Now, let's go back to her. Anybody want to guess? No, let's not guess. Okay, this is another story from maybe 6, 8 months later.
Okay. No, we're done. We're done. You're under arrest. We're going. We're done.
The Utah nurse whose rough arrest was caught on camera is taking a settlement. Now, we told you about this case back in July when the body camera video led to widespread outrage. The nurse, Alex Wubbles, refused an officer's order to draw blood from an unconscious patient after a car crash. She was following the hospital policy, which requires a warrant or the patient's consent. But an officer handcuffed her and dragged her outside. Well, Wubbles announced today that she is settling with Salt Lake City and the university that runs the hospital for $500,000. She plans to give a portion of the payout to a nurses union and help lead a campaign to end physical and verbal abuse of nurses on the job. The police chief has apologized, firing one of the officers involved and demoting the other. Both are appealing.
And that was the outcome of that case. So $500,000 because somebody in the police department didn't want to know the law. And again, what she basically said she said the same thing I said. You bring me a warrant and I'll draw all the blood you want. And again, that's what I'm saying. This was a unique case because that isn't always the case. I'm going to say this. That was 2000, I forgot what year, 17, maybe a little earlier. It was always the opposite. If you want blood, I don't want a warrant. You're a police officer. How much do you need? Now it's shifting. But that's what I'm just trying to say, that, she did the right thing even back then. That, look, if you bring me a warrant, I'll give you all the blood you want. But right now, I'm not giving it to you. And their policy was correct. Their policy was steeped in law. She went to the policy. You see, she had it there. And she's like, no, I can't give it to you because I need a warrant because I'm violating all these other things. So that's why I said, it's good to, this is why I'm telling clinicians to know this stuff, because you don't realize, if she gave the blood, in theory, she could have jeopardized a lot of legal issues here for that hospital, as well as the man who was, he wasn't even DUI, by the way, he was a truck driver, and there was no alcohol in the system when they did do the test. So, again, it's one of those things where I say, you don't need, this stuff isn't for people who work in prisons, it's for people who work in the healthcare field. So, that's it, folks. That's all, folks.